The moment I saw him step off that train, the coffee I'd been gripping for 20 minutes went cold in my hand. Not because of the November air cutting through the station parking lot, because the woman beside him was laughing at something he'd said, and the way he touched the small of her back, easy, familiar, like he'd done it 1,000 times, told me everything I needed to know before my brain had even caught up. And the worst part? My phone was still buzzing in my coat pocket with his text. "Honey, they held me up a couple more days, don't worry. Love you." I want to tell you I did something brave right then. I want to tell you I walked up to them, stood my ground, made him explain himself in front of the whole station. But I was 24 years old, standing alone in a small-town train station in Millhaven, Ohio, wearing scrubs under my winter coat because I'd driven straight from a 12-hour shift, and every single thing I thought I knew about my life had just tilted sideways in the span of about 8 seconds. So I stood there, and I watched. And what I saw next, that's what really broke me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to before all of this, back to when Millhaven still felt like home, and my marriage still felt like mine. I grew up in a big city, Columbus, specifically, loud, sprawling, the kind of place where you can disappear into a crowd and nobody notices. When I got my EMT certification at 20 and started working toward my paramedic license, I figured I'd spend my career in Columbus traffic, running calls on the freeway, the whole chaotic mess of it. Then I met Derek at a mutual friend's birthday party, and 3 months later, I was visiting Millhaven for the first time, and 6 months after that, I was moving into his house on Clover Street. Millhaven is the kind of town where the gas station attendant knows your name. Population just under 9,000, one diner, one pharmacy, one high school with a football team that everyone treats like a religion. The surrounding county had enough ground ambulance coverage that there was actually a decent-sized EMS station, and they were hiring. And Derek was already settled there with his job at the county assessor's office, and I don't know, it just made sense at the time. Love makes you relocate your whole life and call it a choice. We got married in June, 2 years before all of this happened. Small ceremony. My parents drove up from Columbus, a handful of Derek's coworkers came, and his family, his mom, Connie, and his sister Raylene, sat in the front row looking like they'd been asked to attend a funeral instead of a wedding. I noticed it. I told myself I was being paranoid. Raylene was 27 then, 2 years older than Derek and 4 years older than me. She worked at the county clerk's office, lived in an apartment about a mile from our house, and had an opinion about absolutely everything. What Derek ate, what Derek spent, what Derek's wife, meaning me, was doing with her life. She never said anything outright cruel, not in the beginning. It was always just this low hum of skepticism, a raised eyebrow when I mentioned a purchase, a little pause before she answered a question I'd asked, like she was deciding whether I deserved a response. Derek always said I was too sensitive. "That's just how Raylene is," he'd tell me. "She doesn't mean anything by it. You'll get used to her." I tried. I genuinely tried. Our house on Clover Street was small, but felt like ours. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with yellow tile that I hated and Derek loved, a backyard that got muddy every spring and stayed muddy until June. We'd talked about repainting the kitchen, about maybe getting a dog someday, about the fact that I was working toward my paramedic certification and what that would mean for our income once I finished. Normal countries, future-shaped conversations. Derek's daughter Piper was 7 when I moved in, 8 by the time we got married. She lived primarily with her mom Gina, who had full custody, with Derek getting every other weekend and some holidays. Piper was quiet, observant, the kind of kid who watched adults carefully and filed everything away. She had this little hamster she'd named Twitch, a tiny gray thing that ran its wheel at approximately 2 in the morning every single night, and she brought him in his cage on her weekend visits. I'd lie awake listening to that wheel spin and somehow find it comforting. this small proof that a child trusted our house enough to bring something she loved into it. Raylene did not approve of me as a stepmother figure. She made that clear in the way she'd ask Piper questions in front of me. Does Noelle let you eat the things you like? Does Noelle make you clean up after yourself all weekend? Piper, to her credit, would just blink at her aunt and say things like, Noelle taught me how to make scrambled eggs, which was not the answer Raylene was looking for. My name, by the way, is Noelle. I was born December 23rd, and my parents thought they were being clever. I've been explaining it my whole life. The first real warning sign, not the Raylene stuff, which I'd already filed under difficult in-laws manageable, came in late September, about 6 weeks before that night at the train station. Derek had started taking these overnight trips for work. Not constantly, maybe once every few weeks. The county assessor's office was apparently involved in some kind of regional property data initiative, which required him to drive up to Cleveland or Columbus for meetings. He'd explained it all to me in reasonable detail, the grant funding involved, the other counties participating, the reason it had to be in person rather than on a call. It made sense. I worked irregular shifts, and he worked a 9 to 5. Our schedules already didn't line up perfectly. I didn't think much of it. What I did notice was that he'd started being a little more careful with his phone. Not dramatically so, just screen down on the counter when before it had been screen up, taken into the bathroom when before it had stayed on the charger. Small things. The kind of things you notice and then immediately feel guilty for noticing, because noticing them means you're suspicious, and being suspicious means you're that kind of wife. I mentioned it once, lightly, the way you do when you're hoping to be reassured. We were in the kitchen after dinner, early October, rain coming down outside. I said something like, "You've been on your phone a lot lately," and I smiled when I said it so it wouldn't sound like an accusation. Derek looked up from the sink where he was rinsing dishes and said, "The project's got a deadline, lots of emails." Perfectly reasonable, calm. And then he said, "Raylene mentioned you called her last week to ask about my schedule." I had not called Raylene. I had texted her once to ask if she knew what time Derek's meeting ended, because I wanted to have dinner ready. One text, because Derek hadn't answered his phone. "I texted her," I said, "once, because you weren't picking up. She said you sounded worked up about it." I felt that little prickle behind my eyes, not tears, not yet, just the pressure that comes before them. I wasn't worked up. I just wanted to know when to have food ready. Derek dried his hands on the dish towel and gave me this look, patient, slightly tired. "Noelle, you've been a little anxious lately. I think the night shifts are getting to you. Maybe talk to someone?" And there it was. Not, "You're wrong," just, "You're not well enough to trust your own read on things." I've learned since then that there's a name for that. But at 24, 2 years into a marriage in a town where I barely knew anyone outside of my coworkers, I did what I always did when Derek said something like that. I told myself maybe he was right. I was working a lot of overnight shifts. I was tired. I was probably reading into things. By the time November rolled in, gray, damp, the kind of Ohio November that feels like the sky has just given up, I had almost convinced myself that everything was fine. Derek was going up to Columbus for another 2-day trip. He kissed me goodbye on a Tuesday morning, told me he loved me, said he'd text when he got there. He texted when he got there. He texted Wednesday night to say the meetings were running long. He texted Thursday morning to say he'd be home Thursday evening on the 6:40 train. I had the day off. I'd picked up an extra shift the week before, and my supervisor had given me Thursday as a comp day. I decided, somewhere around noon, that I was going to do something nice, something normal couple. I was going to drive to the station and surprise him, and we were going to drive home together, and I was going to stop feeling the way I'd been feeling. I made a thermos of coffee. I put on my coat over my scrubs because I hadn't bothered changing. I drove the 11 minutes to the Millhaven station, and I parked and I waited. His train pulled in right on time, and then my phone buzzed. "Honey, they held me up a couple more days, don't worry, love you." I read it twice. I looked up at the train. I looked back down at my phone. The doors were opening, and Derek stepped out onto the platform. He was wearing his gray wool coat, the one I'd helped him pick out at an outlet store in Columbus last winter. He had his overnight bag on his shoulder. He was smiling, not at me, because he had no idea I was there, at the woman walking beside him. She was maybe 30, dark hair pulled back, a tote bag on one arm, and he put his hand on the small of her back, and she leaned slightly into it, and they walked toward the station exit together like two people who had done exactly this before. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold. The platform was mostly empty now, that hollow quiet after a train empties out. I was standing behind my car. I'd gotten out to wait, and neither of them had seen me. My legs were moving before I'd made any decision to follow them. That's the only way I can explain it. My body just went. They walked through the station and out the front entrance and across the parking lot, and I kept maybe 40 feet behind them, close enough to see but not so close that... They stopped at a dark blue Civic I didn't recognize. Not Derek's car. His was still in our driveway. He'd taken the train. The woman unlocked it. Derek put his bag in the back seat. They stood by the driver's side door for a moment, talking, and then she reached up and touched his face with both hands, and he let her. And then he looked up, not at me, across the parking lot, toward the road. Just a reflex maybe, some instinct, but for 1 second his face was turned in my direction, lit by the flat gray November light, and I could see it clearly. He looked completely at ease, relaxed, like a man with nothing to worry about. I pressed myself back against the concrete pillar near the station entrance, and my heart was going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. My phone was still in my hand. His text was still on the screen. "Don't worry, love you." That was when I heard footsteps behind me, quick, deliberate, and a voice I knew too well said, quietly and close to my ear, "Noelle, what are you doing here?" I turned around. Raylene was standing 3 feet away, car keys in her hand, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not surprised, not caught, just watchful. "I came to pick up Derek," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. She glanced past me toward the parking lot, then back at me. "Derek's not here," she said. "He texted me this afternoon. He's stuck in Columbus 2 more days." I stared at her. "He just got off that train." Something moved across her face, quick, practiced. "Noelle." She said my name the way you'd say it to someone you were worried about, gentle, careful. "You've been under a lot of stress lately. Are you sure you're not—" "I saw him," I said. "He's right there in that parking lot." She put her hand on my arm. Her grip was firm. "Come on, let me walk you to your car. You shouldn't be driving if you're this worked up." And that was the moment I understood. Not everything, not yet, not the full shape of what I was standing inside of, but enough. Raylene hadn't pulled in behind me by accident. She was here before Derek's train arrived, and she was not surprised to see me. She'd known I was coming. I didn't move. I just stood there with Raylene's hand on my arm, her grip firm and steady, and I looked at her face and thought, she knew I was coming. There was only one way she could have known. Derek had texted her, either before he got on that train or the moment he saw my car in the lot, though I didn't think he'd seen me. I wasn't certain. Or maybe there was some other system I hadn't figured out yet. But the logistics didn't matter right then. What mattered was that Raylene was standing in front of me, telling me I was confused, telling me I was stressed, and her eyes had that practiced steadiness of someone running a script they'd rehearsed. "I need to go," I said. "Noelle." She tightened her grip just slightly. "You're shaking. Let me drive you home." "I drove myself here. I can drive myself home." I pulled my arm free. I walked to my car. I didn't look back at the parking lot, because if I had looked back and seen Derek still standing there by that blue Civic with his hand on that woman's face, I would have done something I couldn't take back. I could feel it in my chest, this pressure, like a fist pushing outward from inside my ribs. I got in my car. I sat there for 60 seconds, then I drove home. The house on Clover Street was dark when I pulled into the driveway. I hadn't left any lights on because I'd planned on Derek being with me when we got back. I sat in the car in the dark for a while, thermos of cold coffee still in the cup holder, and I thought about the way he touched the small of that woman's back. Easy, familiar, like muscle memory. I went inside. I fed myself something, crackers, I think, and peanut butter straight from the jar because I couldn't make myself stand at the stove. I sat on the couch in my scrubs and I stared at my phone and I waited for Derek to text again. He didn't, not that night. Around 10 o'clock I went to bed. I lay flat on my back in the dark and listened to the house settle, and I thought, very clearly and calmly, I am not crazy. I saw what I saw. A man who looked exactly like my husband, wearing the coat I helped him pick out, got off the train he told me he wasn't on, and his sister showed up to manage me. That was the thought I held on to. It was the only solid thing I had. I didn't sleep. Derek came home the following evening. He texted at 4 in the afternoon, just wrapped up, catching the 5:15, be home by 7, love you. And I texted back, okay, see you soon, with a little heart emoji. And I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the yellow cabinets and my knees pulled up to my chest, and I breathed. I'd spent the previous 20 hours thinking about what to do, and I'd landed on one decision. I was not going to confront him. Not yet. Not without something more than what I'd seen in a parking lot, because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. He would be calm. He would be reasonable. He would say he had taken an earlier train, that he'd gotten a ride from a colleague, that I'd misread a normal interaction between coworkers. He would say I was anxious. He would say I needed to talk to someone, and Raylene would back up every word. I needed to know who that woman was. Derek walked in at 7:12, dropped his bag by the door, kissed my cheek, said the meetings had been exhausting and he was glad to be home. I had dinner on the table. Pasta, nothing complicated. He ate 2 helpings. He told me about a property data issue in Cuyahoga County that had apparently caused a real headache for the project. I listened and nodded and asked questions in the right places, and I watched his face the whole time, looking for the seam, the place where the performance didn't quite hold. I didn't find it. He was very good. After dinner, he fell asleep on the couch watching a game. I took his phone off the coffee table. I want to be honest about this. I had never gone through his phone before, not once in 2 years of marriage. I believed in privacy. I believed in trust. I believed that going through your spouse's phone was a line you crossed only when you'd already decided the marriage was over. I had told myself that more than once. I crossed it. The phone was passcode locked. I didn't know the code. I'd never had reason to know it. I tried our anniversary, June 14th, and it didn't work. I tried Piper's birthday, March 3rd, and it didn't work. I put the phone back on the coffee table before I tried a third time and got locked out. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and felt completely and utterly alone. That was the bottom, I think. Not the train station, not the parking lot, not even Raylene's hand on my arm. The bottom was sitting on the edge of my own bed in my own house, not knowing the passcode to my husband's phone, understanding for the first time that there was a whole interior life he'd been running parallel to mine, and I was only now starting to realize how long it had probably been going on. I thought about calling my mom. She was in Columbus, about 90 miles away, and she would have answered no matter what time I called. But I didn't know how to explain it without sounding like exactly what Derek kept suggesting I was, a stressed, anxious woman who was reading too much into things. The doubt was still there. It had been planted carefully over weeks and months, and it didn't just disappear because I'd seen something in a parking lot. I thought about calling a coworker. There was a woman at the EMS station named Bridget, mid-30s, 10 years on the job, the kind of person who seemed like she'd heard everything, and she'd been friendly with me since I started. But we weren't close, not really. We were work-friendly. I didn't know her well enough to show up at her door with this. I had no one in Millhaven. That was the real bottom. I had moved 90 miles from everyone I knew, into a town where the closest thing I had to a friend was a coworker I barely knew outside of shift handoffs, and the only family around was Derek's, which meant Raylene, which meant his. I cried that night, I'll tell you that plainly. I sat in the bathroom with the door locked and the water running, and I cried, the ugly, silent kind of crying, the kind where your whole face goes hot and your chest aches and you press your hand over your mouth so no sound comes out. I cried for about 15 minutes. Then I washed my face with cold water and looked at myself in the mirror and said, out loud, to my own reflection, "Figure it out." It's a thing my dad used to say, not harshly, just practically. Something's broken, figure out how to fix it. He was an HVAC technician his whole career, and he approached most of life's problems the way he approached a busted furnace, systematically, without panic, one component at a time. I started thinking like that. What did I know for certain? Derek had gotten off that train. He had been with a woman. He had sent me a text lying about where he was while he was standing 30 feet away from me. Raylene had shown up at the station and had known I was there, or had known there was a chance I'd be there, and had tried to get me to leave. What did I need to find out? Who the woman was, how long this had been happening, what Raylene knew and when she'd known it. How was I going to find that out? That was the part I didn't have yet. I went back to bed. Derek was already upstairs by then, already asleep. I lay beside him and stared at the ceiling and started making a list in my head. The next morning I drove to work, and on my lunch break I sat in the break room with my phone and searched the county assessor's office website. The Columbus and Cuyahoga County meetings that Derek had mentioned, the Regional Property Data Initiative, I looked for any public record of it. Grant announcements, meeting agendas, anything. I found nothing. Not for the specific meetings he'd described, not for the dates he'd given me. That didn't prove anything necessarily. Not all government meetings made it onto public-facing websites, but it was a thread, and I pulled it. I texted Bridget that afternoon. Not about Derek. I wasn't ready for that. I texted her to ask if she wanted to grab coffee after our shift on Friday, and she texted back within 10 minutes. "Yes, finally. I've been meaning to ask you for months." That made me feel, briefly, slightly less like I was drowning. Friday morning, 2 days later, I walked into Millhaven's one coffee shop, a small place called Grounds, off Main Street. Dark green walls and mismatched chairs, and Bridget was already there with 2 cups waiting. She was tall, red-haired, and she had this directness about her that I'd always found steadying on calls. She looked at me for about 30 seconds after I sat down and said, "Okay, what's going on?" It wasn't a question. It was the voice she used on scene when she already knew something was wrong and she just needed you to confirm it. I sat with my hands around the warm cup and I told her, not everything, not all at once, but enough. The train, the text, the woman, Raylene in the parking lot, the passcode I didn't know, the meetings I couldn't verify. Bridget listened without interrupting, which is harder than it sounds. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My ex-husband did something similar. Not exactly the same, but the parallel scheduling, the way they get other people to run interference." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "The woman in that parking lot, dark hair, tote bag, blue Civic. Did you get the plate?" I hadn't even thought to. "Next time you see that car," Bridget said, "get the plate. You can run it through my cousin. He does private investigations out of Dayton. Nothing illegal, just DMV lookup stuff. $50 and you know who she is by the end of the day." I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief exactly, more like the sensation of solid ground after a long time in water. "There's something else," Bridget said, and her voice went a little quieter. I wasn't going to say anything because it felt like gossip, but there's a woman who brings her dad into our station sometimes, older guy, cardiac history, lives out on Route 9. Her name's Patrice Van, and I have seen her, twice, maybe 3 times in the past 4 months, in a car outside the assessor's office, waiting, the way you wait for someone. I looked at her. Dark hair, Bridget said. She drives a blue Civic. The coffee shop was warm and smelled like espresso, and the radio behind the counter was playing something low and unidentifiable. And I sat very still with that information settling into me like cold water through a crack. Patrice Van. I had a name. Bridget, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, which by now I was starting to recognize as a feature rather than a bug. The paramedic in me that knew how to hold it together when the situation required it. I need to figure out how long this has been going on, and I need to do it without Derek knowing I'm looking. She nodded once, like this was a practical problem with practical solutions, which I suppose it was. Then we start with what we can access without touching his phone, she said. Bank statements, credit cards, his email if you can get into it. Do you share an account for household stuff? We did. A joint checking account and one shared email for household bills and subscriptions. Derek had a separate personal account and a credit card I wasn't on, and I had never paid those things much attention because he handled the finances, and I had trusted that. I have access to the joint account, I said. Then tonight, Bridget said, you sit down and you look at every transaction from the past 6 months, hotels, restaurants, anything that doesn't match a business trip he told you about. Write it down. Don't move money, don't confront him, just look. She paused. And if you find what I think you're going to find, you call a divorce attorney before you say a single word to Derek. I hadn't said the word divorce yet, not even inside my own head, but hearing it out loud, from someone sitting across from me treating it like a logical next step rather than a catastrophe, it didn't break me the way I'd thought it would. It clarified something. I went home that night, and I did exactly what Bridget told me to do. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad, and I went through every transaction in the joint checking account going back 6 months. Derek paid for most things on his personal card, which I couldn't access, but the joint account still told a story. Gas station charges in Columbus on dates when he'd told me he was in Cleveland. A restaurant charge in Dublin, Ohio, a suburb north of Columbus, on a Wednesday evening in August, when he'd supposedly been in back-to-back meetings all day. A hotel I didn't recognize, the Residence Inn off I-270, billed to the joint account once in September for 2 nights. He must have slipped up and used the wrong card for that one, because every other trip had been clean. That single charge was $218. $218. That's what one night of my husband's other life cost, apparently, the night he used the wrong card. I wrote it all down, dates, amounts, locations. Then I closed the laptop and sat there in the quiet kitchen under the yellow tile I'd always hated, and I thought about my dad and his busted furnaces, one component at a time. Bridget's cousin in Dayton was named Russell. She texted me his number the next morning, and I called him on my lunch break, standing in the parking lot behind the EMS station, with the November wind coming off the fields. I described the blue Civic. I told him I hadn't gotten the plate. He asked if I had a name. Patrice Van, I said. She lives somewhere in this county. Her father has a cardiac history. He lives out on Route 9. Russell said, give him 24 hours. He called me back in 14. Patrice Van, 31 years old, address on Sycamore Lane in Millhaven, 7 minutes from our house on Clover Street. She worked as an administrative coordinator at the county assessor's office. I sat with that for a long moment, phone pressed to my ear, the wind still cutting across the parking lot. She worked at the county assessor's office, where Derek worked. She hadn't been a woman he'd met on a business trip or at a conference in Columbus. She was someone he saw every single day he walked into work, someone who'd been there the whole time, someone who probably knew me by name, Derek's wife, Noelle, the paramedic, and had smiled about it. "Thank you," I said to Russell. My voice was completely flat, and I didn't try to fix that. That same afternoon, I called a family law attorney in Columbus named Sandra Price, whose name I'd found by spending 40 minutes reading reviews on a legal referral site during a break between calls. Her assistant picked up. I explained I needed a consultation, and they got me in for the following Tuesday. I told no one, not Bridget, not yet. I needed to walk into that office first and understand what I was actually looking at before I said it out loud. I kept living my life in the meantime. I cooked dinner. I asked Derek about his day. I laughed at the right moments in front of the television. I was so steady that it frightened me a little, this new, still, purposeful version of myself that had apparently been waiting inside the anxious one all along. On Monday, the day before my attorney consultation, Derek mentioned at breakfast that Piper would be coming for the weekend after next. "Gina has some family thing," he said, not looking up from his phone, "so she's coming Thursday through Sunday." I said that sounded great. I meant it. Whatever was happening between Derek and me, Piper had nothing to do with it, and I was not going to let any of this touch her if I could help it. Sandra Price's office was on the 4th floor of a building in the short north, all glass and clean lines. She was in her late 40s, compact and efficient, with the kind of steady eye contact that made you feel like she had heard everything before and nothing would surprise her. I laid out what I had: the train station, the text, Raylene in the parking lot, the bank records, Patrice Van's employment at the assessor's office, the hotel charge. Sandra listened. She made notes. When I finished, she said, "Ohio is a no-fault state, which means the affair itself doesn't directly impact the divorce settlement in most cases. But financial misconduct, using marital assets to fund an affair, that's different. That hotel charge on the joint account is potentially actionable. And if there's more of it that ran through his personal card, we can subpoena those records in discovery." Discovery. Subpoena. Words that meant this was real. Words that meant I was sitting in a divorce attorney's office and I had not made any of this up. "How long does this typically take?" I asked. "From filing to finalized in Ohio, if he contests, 6 months minimum. If he cooperates, we can potentially move faster. Do you have any joint assets beyond the checking account?" The house on Clover Street. We'd bought it together, both names on the deed, though Derek had put in the down payment from savings he'd had before we married. I told her that. She nodded and made more notes and told me what my options looked like. I drove home with a folder of intake paperwork in my passenger seat, and I felt for the first time in weeks like I was standing on actual ground. I didn't file yet. I wanted one more thing first. I wanted him to have to look at me when he knew that I knew. I'd been thinking about how to do it, and I'd realized I didn't want to do it alone. Not because I was afraid, I wasn't, not anymore, but because I'd watched Raylene manage me in that parking lot, and I knew Derek was very good at making reality feel slippery in the moment, and I wanted a witness, someone who'd been there, someone whose account of events couldn't be rewritten later. I asked Bridget if she'd come. She said yes without hesitating, which I will not forget for the rest of my life. We picked a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after my attorney consultation. Derek's habit on Saturdays was to sleep until 8, then make coffee and sit with his phone for an hour before doing anything. Piper's visit wasn't until the following week. The house would be quiet. I told Bridget to park down the street and come to the door at 8:30. That morning, I got up before Derek, and I sat at the kitchen table with the folder Sandra had helped me compile. Printed bank records, Russell's report on Patrice Van, including her employment at the assessor's office, and a single printed screenshot of Derek's text to me from the train station, time-stamped, with his name at the top of the thread. "Honey, they held me up a couple more days, don't worry, love you." Sent at 6:43 p.m. The train had pulled in at 6:40. Derek came downstairs at 7:58. He was wearing the gray sweatshirt he always wore on weekend mornings, hair still flat from sleep, and he stopped when he saw me sitting at the table with papers in front of me. "Morning," he said, cautious in a way that told me some part of him registered that something was off. "Sit down, Derek." He sat. He looked at the papers. He looked at me. "I was at the station," I said, 3 weeks ago. When you texted me that they'd held you up 2 more days, you were 30 feet away from me, getting off the 6:40 train with Patrice Van." The way his face moved, that small, involuntary tightening around the eyes, that was the only honest thing he did in the next 10 minutes. "Noelle," he said, and his voice was already shifting into the calm, patient register I knew so well. "I don't know what you think you saw." "Her name is Patrice Van," I said. "She's 31. She works in your office. She drives a blue Civic. She lives on Sycamore Lane, which is 7 minutes from this house. The Residence Inn off I-270, September 14th and 15th, you charged 2 nights to our joint account. That's one of the things that showed up when I went through the last 6 months of transactions." I slid the bank records across the table. "There's also a restaurant in Dublin on a Wednesday in August, and gas station charges in Columbus on dates you told me you were in Cleveland." He looked at the papers. He didn't touch them. "I want you to understand something," I said. "I'm not asking you to explain. I'm not looking for an apology. I have an attorney. I have a consultation on record, and I have all of this documented." The doorbell rang at 8:30 exactly. Derek's head came up. "Who is that?" "Bridget. She's going to sit with me while we finish this conversation. Because the last time I was somewhere you didn't expect me to be, your sister showed up and told me I was too stressed to trust my own eyes." Something passed across his face then that I hadn't seen before, not the patient, tired look, something closer to actual shame. Bridget came in and sat in the chair at the end of the table without saying anything. She'd brought her own coffee in a travel mug. She set it down and folded her hands and looked at Derek with the same steady, professional calm she brought to every difficult scene we worked together. Derek tried for another minute or two. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said Patrice was a friend, that he'd given her a ride, that the hotel charge was a mistake from a work trip. He said it calmly, because he was very good at calm. "Derek," Bridget said, and it was the first thing she'd said since she sat down. "I've seen her car outside your office, more than once. I've also been sitting at this table for 4 minutes, and I haven't heard you ask Noelle how she's doing." He stopped. That was it. That was the thing that broke the performance. Not the bank records, not the printed text. A woman he barely knew pointing out that in 4 minutes of defending himself, he hadn't once looked at me the way a husband looks at his wife. He put his hands flat on the table, and he stared at them for a long moment, and then he said, quietly, "How long have you known?" "Since the train station," I said. He nodded slowly, like a man accepting a verdict he'd known was coming. The divorce was filed in December. Sandra had it moving quickly because Derek didn't fight it. I think the documented financial misconduct gave him reason to cooperate, and I think some part of him, whatever was left of the person I'd married, understood that he'd been caught cleanly, and there was no version of this he could win. The Residence Inn charge came back to him in the settlement. The joint account was split. The house on Clover Street was appraised at $214,000. I got my share of the equity, which came to a little over $31,000 after costs, enough to put a deposit on an apartment in Columbus and have a cushion while I got settled. I moved in February into a second-floor apartment in Clintonville with high ceilings and windows that let in the morning light. I transferred my paramedic licensure and got in a position with Columbus Fire. Better pay, bigger station, the kind of chaotic, busy system I'd trained for in the first place. Raylene sent me a text 2 weeks after the filing that said, "I hope you understand I was just trying to protect my brother." I read it once, and then I blocked her number. That's all I had to say about that. The part that surprised me, the part I didn't see coming, Piper. Gina reached out to me in January, about a month after the filing, through a text that started with, "I know this is strange," and ended with an invitation to coffee. We met at a place in Columbus, and Gina, who I'd always thought of as a vague, formal presence in Derek's custody schedule, turned out to be a direct, clear-eyed woman who had her own complicated history with Derek's family, and who told me, over a 90-minute conversation, that she'd had her own doubts about him for years and that she was sorry she hadn't found a way to warn me. "Piper asks about you," she said. "She wanted me to tell you that Twitch died last spring." She paused. "The hamster. She said you'd remember him." I did. I remembered lying awake listening to that wheel at 2 a.m. and finding it comforting. "She wanted you to know he lived a good life," Gina said, and something about the way she said it, on behalf of a 10-year-old who'd thought to send that message, made my eyes burn in a way that none of the rest of it had. I sent Piper a card. I told her Twitch sounded like a great hamster.